Allison from GameAnalytics is going to talk to us about accelerating decisions, decision making, from ideation to live ops. Again, a topic I love to hear. So, Allison, go for it.
Thank you. Great. I'll just give a minute to transition here. So, if you have ever struggled with trying to understand what your players want through data, you're not alone. I think this is a unifying factor for everyone who's sitting in the room today. It's either that or you're tired and need a place to sit. Either way, I welcome you. I've spent many years working with studios to try to answer these types of questions, and especially now I have the great privilege of working at GameAnalytics. I need to move that chair, but our logo is also here. Where we work with literally thousands of studios using our platform every day. And I want to attest to you today that using data really has the power to make your decisions easier and your games better. I will never forget in my career as an analyst and working with game studios specifically, these moments of transformation, if you will, where we were flying blind, but then we took a look at some data. An example of that could be Bejeweled Blitz, where we realized that a small change to a progression map could really engage a disengaged group of players. And it did. We worked with the game studios, they made the changes, and it made a significant impact to the game. So those moments where you're not flying blind, you're using some data to move along your decision making can be really exciting. That said, I understand that it's really difficult to get your data in order. It's difficult to start, essentially. So today what I want to do is give you a little bit of a framework talking about 3 specific areas where you can use data and maybe give you some starting points. The first stage in terms of game development and where some data can be applied is in ideation. So when you're trying to decide what game to make in the first place. I was talking with a VC about this earlier today, how they look at this in terms of trying to understand the space and what you're trying to do when you're coming up with your game concepts and how they evaluate games coming in the door is around some market validation. So trying to understand the preferences of players that you're going for, looking for underserved niches or areas with rising demand. Also looking at your competitors directly. Once you have a game concept that you're considering, diving into those successful games to understand what's working and what's not working. To give you a more concrete example, I want to dive into some Market IQ data. Market IQ is GameAnalytics' new ad and competitive intelligence tool, which I recommend you can come and talk to us at our booth about it. But I wanted to dive into word games specifically. This is a game that I love. It's a physical game called Snatch. It is a fast-paced, competitive word-building game. It exists digitally a little bit out there. Do you know it? No. It's a great game, and I bring it up today because maybe you will make this game for me. But we'll take a look at a little bit of data, and you can make your conclusion on your own. So what I did in Market IQ is start looking at downloads, just literally what are the top downloaded word games that are out there. I found 3 things about word games. The primary mechanic is this word building, which Snatch would be part of. The themes, in terms of just looking at the titles of the games and what they represented, were kind of half Zen, half competitive. The competitive being where Snatch would be part of. And then interestingly, very few were 2-player, had 2-player modes. Maybe this means that there's not a market for 2-player modes, but there were some juggernauts here in this space. With Words with Friends, it's a Zynga franchise, if you don't know it. And then Scrabble Go, which is by Scopely. So there's some big competitors in the word game space. When you layer on revenue, the story deepens, if you will. I wanted to see if this 2-player mode gave these games a leg up in terms of revenue. These are the 2 starred games here, Scrabble Go and Words with Friends. The answer is no to that. It doesn't give them a lift, per se, in terms of revenue. They're in the same fray here. And then again, these word-building games are the red dots here as well. So word-building competitive games are highly downloaded and highly revenue generating. So there's a lot of competition out there. I didn't look at this data over time, think something that's interesting, these games have been in the market for some time, so maybe you see some shifts where you want to enter into this space. That would be another way to look at this data. Also, when you're looking in the competitive space, I recommend trying to understand how much promotion is happening around these games as well. So just looking at the number of advertising or the size of advertising that is happening. Both of these games are in the top 20 most promoted word games that are out there. So they have very large UA budgets behind them. Interestingly, the ratio of downloads to the amount of advertising that they're doing is quite low compared to competitors in the space. So to me, that means that they're retargeting with the ads that they're doing. Again, maybe meaning that these games are long in the tooth or a little bit old, and there could be some space to come in. The other thing in looking at ads is less on the data side, but more on the qualitative side, just understanding how these games are positioning themselves in the first place. Words with Friends, for example, it's two-player. Of course, they show the two ladies playing against each other. I think they're two different people. But then they also really hone in onto the different modes as well. And so that's kind of their positioning and how they see themselves in the market. Whereas this other game of Scrabble Go, this is really all about that two-player mode. All of their ads were talking about competing against another player. So again, this is the kind of data you can start to get before you even write a line of code. With some market IQ data as an example. There's other things you can do to start gathering data in your ideation phase. Running some UA campaigns is a method highly popular with hyper-casual, but I do recommend doing that to understand if you can have some marketability for the game concepts that you have. Building community, maybe this is more relevant for your Steam or console games, but getting that feedback early on. And then, of course, playtesting specifically. And this brings me into my next section here on iteration. So the next phase of analysis that you might be doing is this, where you are doing your testing, your learning, and your optimizing. Games really are not a static entity at all. There's a lot of interconnected parts in terms of your gameplay. You have your gameplay and your metagame that was just asked about. You have your monetization, your progression systems. It's very difficult to get all of this right on the first try. And these dynamics are changing over and over again as you release new content and as your players just want something different within your games as well. So this is something that you start before launch, and then it continues pretty much forever and ever. There are two methodologies that I like to highlight in terms of this phase of testing and iterating. Because I say testing, but really what you're trying to do is gather some meaningful data and insights around first observing the data and then testing after that. I want to change this slide actually, where observation would be maybe 90% of what your effort would be. This is simply looking at the patterns, the trends, the relationships in the data to try to understand what's going on. You can do that and you can make changes to your game and see if it changes that overall trend. As opposed to A/B testing, which is where you are doing more controlled testing hypotheses. The observation can help you create what those hypotheses should be, but I really highly recommend not jumping straight into A/B testing before you understand the full landscape of what you're looking at. There was David Nelson, I believe, he's former king, now building up his own studio in Malmö, who said that if you are running an A/B test, you should almost be scared of what the results are going to be because you're testing something that significant for your game. So again, this iteration phase starts before launch and continues pretty much forever. I do want to talk about just finding some balance with this because there is an analysis paralysis that you can get into. And as you're approaching launch, you need to be considering what's going on with your budget and, of course, time to market as well, and finding some balance with the viability signals that you're pushing for. Now, viability signals fall around your acquisition, your engagement, and your monetization themes. The next 3 slides I'm going to go over super quickly just because of time. They have a lot of detail, and I'm happy to share the slides so you can go into them afterward. But what they do is give a little bit of some ideas for specific pieces of data that you can be looking at and some other areas where you can optimize, again, around these three themes. So acquisition, how you're getting players in the first place. engagement, how you're holding onto them through your gameplay. Engagement is very expansive, the types of data you can be looking at, so really just a starting point. And then monetization as well, so all about how you are bringing money in the door. To give a maybe tighter example of using these types of data and kind of the testing and making different optimizations to your game, I want to talk about Paradoxum. Paradoxum develops games for Roblox. They launched Tower Defense Simulator in 2019 as a school project. They're a young group of kids. They've had 3.4 billion visits since the launch of it, and they were really struggling as they had this success on Roblox to continue having deep engagement and retention and monetization. So they integrated GameAnalytics to look at some of these types of data. They were looking at win-loss ratios, their win and loss counts per user. And what they did with that is adjust the game modes that were too easy, but also the game modes that were too hard to try to bring things to the middle. Another thing they did was some custom heat map tracking using GameAnalytics as well to help redesign their maps around where players were placing towers. They pretty much found it was almost placing the towers in the same place over and over and over again. So they realized that they needed to have some more strategic or diverse placement of towers to make the game more fun. They also optimized their tutorial steps, just looking at the drop-off in their first-time user funnel. And it was less about the drop-off and more about the time spent at each of the different stages that they wanted to optimize. They found that the players were moving through the funnel just fine, but really they were spending too much time on steps within the funnel before getting into the core gameplay. So that's where they did their optimizations. So the last phase here is live ops, and there was some interesting commentary earlier around live ops, like what is this thing anyway? And the Nexon CEO says that live ops is 1,000 little things, and I definitely believe that. It's when you're in the live ops stage, it's all around sustaining your engagement, maximizing your retention, monetization, and just continuing to adapt. Others on the track today, I think, will talk more deeply about this as well, and there are different angles on it. But what my angle is on live ops is actually around the analysis method of segmentation. So what you want to be doing is targeting, diving into your data to look at specific groups of users, and then understanding the distribution of those and how they behave over time as opposed to the high-level trend of your data. When you are doing this segmentation, it again kind of falls into the two categories of engagement and monetization. So grouping your players based on signals around engagement, things like they're spending a lot of time in your game, they frequently return to your game, they're engaging in particular parts of your game like collecting the daily bonus or playing on a guild to try to figure out what is my signal for a highly engaged or a low engaged player, and what are those players doing in terms of the rest of my ecosystem within the game. And then monetization groupings as well. So where are players spending? What are they buying? What is their first purchase, for example? And then segmenting those groups and looking at their behavior over time. At GameAnalytics, we're building a new tool called our user analysis tool that helps do this more programmatically, where you don't have to be getting into SQL. We can help you build these segments and look at them. It's also something where you don't have to build the segment in the first place. So sometimes you don't know exactly what segments you want to be looking at. You just want to be analyzing the data after it's coming in, and we're building a new feature that I'd love to talk to you about if you're interested. My last point here is just around not sleeping on low value segments as well. When I hear about live ops segmentation, it's like find your high value segments and build for those high value segments. But I also think it's important to look at your low value segments as well. These were a couple of examples actually from way back at my time at PopCap, where we were building a, a hidden object game. And what we found is that in this game that we had, which was game one, that the non-monetizers were just not returning to the game. And you could think of a non-monetizer as a low-value segment, but when you compared to other games, they were not returning as much as they should be. So it was kind of trying to figure out what's going on with these non-monetizers in that's driving them not to come back, essentially. So it's a group to keep in mind as well. And same with in-app purchase preferences. You have your low. In this game, we had a lot of people making low purchases. This doesn't show the scale of how many were low to high. But a lot of players would make that first purchase of a starter pack, but they wouldn't move forward in terms of spending more money in the game. And what we realized is that there were no coins in the starter pack. So we needed to inspire them to figure out what you could do with coins by putting it in the starter pack so that we could move them through. So these are some of the things that you can figure out by looking at the low value segments as well. So data really is a strategy that you can use in a lot of different ways. I do think it starts early. It's a muscle that you build up over time, beginning in your ideation phase, through your launch as you're testing and learning, and kind of into your live ops direction as well, particularly when your game has some success. I hope today inspired you to get started with using data if you're not already. If you are, I hope it inspired you to add a new methodology. I would love to speak to each of you. I'm also on the panel later. We are having a webinar as well on this topic next week with a couple of studios. If you're interested in hearing a bit more from that angle as well, Thomas, who is here, can give you a flyer about it on your way out the door. But I do welcome any questions as well.
Thank you very much.